One of the questions that I always get is, how do you get a job like being head of the National Park Service? Well, it's kind of interesting because it takes a little bit of political and a little bit of educational experience helps. And I'd gone to Indiana University and gotten a degree, undergraduate and a master's degree in Parks Administration, which I had never really used that much, but it came in very handy when the opportunity came to be head of the National Parks, because I had the right educational background, and the political background is probably the interesting part. I was living in West Lafayette and working for a company called Great Lakes Chemical, and I got a call from a young guy that I didn't know, Dan Quayle. He said, I'm a congressman from over in Fort Wayne, and I want to run against Birch Bayh for the Senate seat. And I said, well, that's very interesting, but you know, no one even knows your name over here on this side of the state. He said, well, that's why I'm calling you. I want you to be a campaign fundraiser and so forth, so on for me on the West Lafayette side of the world, which was really Birch Bayh country. I mean, you know, he was a Purdue graduate and all that sort of thing. So I said I would, and my first event that I ever ran politically was a $5 per couple chili supper. Now, you know, $5 a couple. You get these things from the politicians like $100, $200, whatever. $5 a couple, and had a good turnout. Dan didn't make it. There was bad weather or something. So I mean, I got all these friends. You know how you have to do politically, you twist everyone's arm. Got them all there. He didn't show up. So I said, okay, I'll give him one more chance. I did a $50 a couple at a racquetball club that my wife and I own, and the idea was you come and you play the candidate and so forth and so on. So I had all the people there, I bought the food and so forth and so on, and he called again and he said, there's bad weather between here and Fort Wayne to Lafayette, the pilot says he doesn't want to fly. And I said, if you don't get here on this event after I twist all these arms, that's my last event. I'm not doing anything else. So he called back and he said, maybe we can fly around the storm. I didn't realize there really was a big storm, but there was a big storm. So they flew down to Indianapolis and around over into Illinois and came in from the backside. And when he got off the plane, he was green. I mean, they were sick. And he said, I'll get even with you if that's the last thing. But he played racquetball. He played very well. He was a good athlete. Dan Quayle was a good athlete. So I raised money for Dan Quayle. The same year, Governor Orr was running, or he wasn't governor yet, but he was running for office, and he had asked me if I would raise money also for him. And the same year, President Reagan was running for his first term, and he asked if I would raise money for him. And I raised a record amount of money out of Tippecanoe County for all three of those candidates that year. And after that, Dan Quayle offered me the job of Chief of Staff in Washington for his office. President Reagan appointed me on the Great Lakes Commission, and Bob Orr offered me the Director of the Department of Natural Resources. Didn't want to go to Washington, so I ended up being the Director of Natural Resources for 8 years, and then went to Washington under President Bush with Bob Orr's recommendation and Senator Lugar's recommendation, and became Director of the National Park Service. So there you can see, when Bob Orr appointed me, he said, it's perfect. You've got enough political credentials that the political types can't be unhappy. And you've got the educational experience so that the people who look at this from a rational basis can say, you know, this makes sense. So that's how you get to become Director of the National Park Service. I wanted to make a point. Did you guys throw a marker up here somewhere? Oh, over here. Just a quick point I want to make, because I don't think a lot of people totally understand. I want to make a point that you've got the National Park Service, you've got the Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service, you've got the Fish and Wildlife Service, and you got a thing that most people in eastern Mississippi don't realize. It's called the Bureau of Land Management. Now, among those four agencies, they manage 1/3 of all of the United States. So that is a lot. When those 4 directors would get together, they were called the Big Four, primarily the group, because they managed so much land. The Park Service would manage about 100 million acres. 100 million acres. How many acres are there in the state of Indiana? 25 million. So about 4 times the amount of the land that's in the state of Indiana. Fish and Wildlife Service would be a little bit bigger, maybe 120 million. Forest Service probably now is close to 200 million. And the BLM, biggest of all, 300 million. Now, the interesting thing is, if you talk about, this will make the point, I think. About 18,000 employees here at the National Park Service, and at the BLM, only maybe 7,000. Well, that gives you a hint right off the bat as to the level of management that occurs on the acreages. If you're managing 300 million acres with 7,000 employees, and you're managing 100 million with 18,000 employees, obviously it's a more intensive management that takes place at the National Park Service. So when you go out west and you see these vast lands where there just appears to be nothing, well, that's the Bureau of Land Management largely, and they don't manage intensively. It's open for mining usually, drilling, a lot of cattle grazing. In other words, it's typically not a touristy kind of place to go. It's a place to go hunting. They'd have some camping, things of that nature. Now the Forest Service, they would have approximately, 20,000 employees. So they manage fairly intensively, but they manage, at least traditionally what they're supposed to do, is manage for a product, forestry. And a lot of people don't really understand that. Some of the strong environmental groups would like to think that the Forest Service is in fact the Park Service. Well, that's not the way Teddy Roosevelt envisioned it. He envisioned that the Park Service would be more preservation oriented, and that the Forest Service would be more like a crop, more like we would handle our corn or our beans or whatever. We would timber harvest in the Forest Service. So there's one of the major environmental arguments that goes on in the country when you see environmental groups that don't want trees cut, but it's in the Forest Service. Well, that's what the agency was made for, was to have the cutting of timber. Sometimes land will transfer if it's particularly of high quality and will go from the Forest Service to the Park Service. And so consequently, there are these lines that are between these agencies, and they have different objectives. Fish and Wildlife Service is pretty obvious. They have fish and wildlife refuge, things of that nature. To some extent, the most preservation-oriented of the group is the National Park Service. And that is a part of their mission, is to preserve and protect. But they have a dual mission, because on the other side of that preserve and protect, and this is a law that goes back into the early 1900s, is a part of the law that says for the enjoyment of the people. Okay, question then comes, how do you preserve and protect and allow for the enjoyment of the people? Well, obviously, if you've got a park and if you don't preserve the major features of those parks, the people that will crowd those parks may destroy the very feature for which the park was created. And so then you get the big arguments about how many people should be allowed in the Yosemite Valley at one time. How many people should be in Yosemite? Should we have snowmobiles in Yosemite? We have all those questions about use. Now, the big manufacturers of four-wheel drive vehicles and things of this nature, they want to use the national parks. But you have to strike a balance. Is their use going to destroy it? If you're riding 60 of the loudest muffler Harley Davidsons in the world through the heart of Yosemite Valley, you know, have you ruined the experience for other people who want to use the park? So the arguments that come are never really easy here, but this one, I believe there's going to be a gradual blurring of the lines, and I think the Forest Service, since it's not being allowed to cut timber as they have in the past, which I also think is leading to some of these buildups for these big fires, the Forest Service is probably going to become more recreation oriented. They're going to have more campgrounds. They're going to have more of the kinds of activities that people want to do that we really would rather they not do in the National Park Service. And speaking about the National Park Service, a lot of people think that everything that's there is a national park. Well, there are national park sites. Of the 370 units in the National Park Service, only about 60 of them are in fact national parks. The rest would have another designation. They might be Civil War battlefields. They might be national scenic rivers. They could be long-distance hiking trails like the Appalachian Trail. There are a number of different things within the Park Service. Historic sites, Ellis Island, Statue of Liberty, the Liberty Bell. In other words, there's all kinds of uses within the National Park Service, and not all of those are national parks. But about 55 of them have the actual name National Park. And that would obviously be Smoky Mountains, for example, Yellowstone as an example, Everglades as an example, Yosemite as an example, the great large acreages of parks up in Alaska, huge acres of parks, parks in Alaska that are in fact nearly as big as the state of Indiana. The biggest park in the lower 48 states is Yellowstone at 2 million acres. But we have parks in Alaska that run around 10 million acres. So huge parks up in Alaska. But I think it's important that people understand the differences in philosophy between and among these agencies, because these people have a different mission, and it's one that is always in conflict. The Congress wrote the bill, and the bill makes sense when you read it, but it also always throws out that question: are you preserving, or are you allowing the public to enjoy? And if the public happens to be that gang of 60 motorcycle riders that I just mentioned, they say, well, we have very much as a right to enjoy that park as anyone else. But the person who went there to hike and be in silence and camp, he's not too excited about 60 motorcycles roaring around the campground. So those are the constant give and takes that you get involved in managing the Park Service. I once met Vice President of General Motors' wife at a party, and she said, well, what do you do? Like, kind of, do you go out and make sure the parks are clean? And I said, well, let me ask you what your husband does. Well, he personally budgets and so forth and so on. I said, well, we have 18,000 employees, 100 million acres scattered from the Virgin Islands clear out to Samoa, Hawaii, Alaska. I said, I really don't have time to pick up the cups and the litter. I do when I go, but I don't necessarily have time. Meeting the boss, it's kind of interesting. The first day I met President and Mrs. Bush, we were having a ceremony commemorating the signing of, it was commemorating George Washington's inauguration. And so I went backstage, and it was in a hall across from Wall Street in New York, and there was the president, and he waved me over, and he said to Mrs. Bush, he said, I want you to meet the young man who's going to, I was younger then, the young man that was going to head up our National Park Service. And Mrs. Bush looked at me and she said, oh, you're the guy that mows the lawn. And I said, I didn't know. I had my deputy director right behind me, and I turned around and I said, do we do that? And he said, said, yes, the National Park Service does in fact take care of the White House. The White House is the National Park Service responsibility. And Mrs. Bush could see that I was a little bit flustered by what she said. And she said, when I turned back to her, she said, and I want to tell you, you do a great job. Because of that, responsibility became a lot more familiar with the president and his wife than you might think, because I was involved in everything from, during the years I was there, we scraped the White House and repainted it. Took off as many as 40-some coats of paint to get down to the original stone. When we got down to the original stone, what did we find? Scorch marks from when the British burned the White House. I was giving a lecture one night when the British ambassador's wife was in the audience. I'd kind of forgotten she was there, but I said, let's don't cover the scorch marks. Let's leave them there to interpret the history of the White House. So everything from the flowers to the curtains. I was chairman of the committee to preserve the White House, and I'll explain it this way. I had a long conference table, and on this end I had experts. I had people who had PhDs in wallpaper. And on this end I had rich people. And my job was to get the PhDs in whatever to decide what we should do about either wallpaper or carpet. And I remember my first meeting was a carpet. We were talking about carpet for the green room. And someone had woven carpet for the White House for like 3 generations of their family. And they wanted to donate one of the carpets, but they wanted to sell the second. And it's kind of like you do at your house. You always buy 2 carpets, right? You put in a carpet, and then as soon as it begins to show a little bit of wear, you quickly pull it out, put the new one in. No one ever realizes that the carpet got worn. Everyone, has enough money to have. Yeah. So it was easy to get the motion to take the gift. I said, all those in favor of accepting the gift of the so forth and family, they say aye. Everyone said aye. Now, how about the one we're supposed to buy? So my goal was to get these experts to say that's the right thing to do, and to get these rich people to pay for it. and because that's how the White House gets redecorated. I mean, there's very little tax dollars go into those kinds of things. So there was a very pregnant pause, and I thought, am I going to get anyone to say anything? And finally there was an elderly lady sitting down here, so elderly in fact that she had a nurse with an oxygen bottle and the whole thing. I thought, I hope she makes a motion before she passes on. She said, my family's been buying carpet for the White House since Franklin Roosevelt. She said, I'll pay for it, send me the bill. I don't think she ever asked what the bill was, but we sent her the bill, and she paid for it. But that's in fact how you decorate the White House. The other interesting fact you might be interested in is that people love to put their own furniture into the White House for a period of time, if they can, like a beautiful hutch or something, because once it comes out of there, it's worth a lot more money. So if you get an antique person who says, gee, would you love to have in the Oval Office this great, so forth and so on, well, I understand he's made a nice gift, but that gift when he gets it back is going to be worth a lot more. So that's a little bit about the White House. I did attend with the president. It was just the president. It was just himself, Mrs. Bush, the dog, and myself, when they put their remarks into a time capsule before they left. I just happened to be in the house, and the president said, hey, you want to come over and witness this? So we're going to put this stuff in the time capsule. And so I know one little secret. I know one thing that's in that time capsule. Because Mrs. Bush made the comment, people are going to open this up 100 years from now and wonder about a president whose dog wrote a book. So Millie's book, you've heard about Millie's book, I know that's in there. What were some of the major issues that I faced as I took over the agency? I got sworn in, and even during the congratulations after being sworn in by the Secretary of Interior, who was Manuel Lujan, former congressman from New Mexico. I got a tap on the shoulder and they said, we need to go to the Situation Room. And I said, Situation Room? I don't even know what the situation is, but the Situation I got in and they said, you're going to need to pack to head for Alaska in the morning because of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which was impacting a lot of National Park Service land all along the Alaskan coast. So that was my introduction to the job. The first day was the Alaskan oil spill. The other one was kind of a holdover from the previous director, but it was still smoldering, play on words. That was Yellowstone fires, the huge fires that engulfed Yellowstone, and those fires, I will tell you, were so intense that nothing could have stopped them short of the snowfall that fell in, I think, September of that year. The old lodge would have been burned down. But the congressmen, especially the western congressmen, were getting all this heat. The Park Service should be doing more about fighting these fires. And they even wanted us to put 2 big bulldozers, D9 bulldozers, and make a big fire break all around the park. That would have been an environmental scar that you could have seen from the satellites. It would have been a terrible thing to do. And this fire was actually jumping ahead of itself as far as a mile over the top of the Continental Divide. I mean, so there was no sense in putting in a fire break. It was just like putting lipstick on a corpse. It might look a little better, but it's still a corpse. So I decided we weren't going to do that. Well, that cost me a lot of political heat up on the hill. And luckily we had the snows came and put the fire out, but that kicked off the whole concept of when are we going to fight fires? Are we going to fight every fire, every time? There's as much as 1,000 lightning strikes a day in Yellowstone alone. Each can set off a fire. You know, there people can set off fires and do. In fact, I'm fairly sure that a lot of the arson fires of that first 1990 in the Northwest, I think were arson fires when they declared the spotted owl as an endangered species, because a lot of the timber guys were losing their jobs because they couldn't cut some of that timber. And a good job, and a good paying job, is fighting fires. So if you set some fires and then get hired to fight the fires, you end up with a job for this fire season. But in any event, I'm going to tell you a story that happened following the Yellowstone fires. I flew out to Yellowstone and I led, and the superintendent wasn't there, but the chief ranger was there. I got to describe the chief ranger. This guy looks like he's just a smaller version of Arnold Schwarzenegger. I mean, he is muscles on top of muscles. And he's an ex-Marine, and to show you his personality, he had lost an eye, and he had an artificial eye, but he had a pure milk white artificial eye extra made with the Marine Corps emblem. So when he would drink a beer or two, he would stick this Marine Corps emblem. Kind of a ferocious looking guy, but he was definitely the guy you want hunting for you if you're lost in Yellowstone. This guy was tough on top of tough. And so I got out of the helicopter and he said, boss, we got another fire going. I said, well, how big is it? He said, about 15,000 acres. I said, well, where is it? He said, well, let's bring up the Pelican Valley. And he says, what do you want to do about it? And I said, well, have you got a high altitude helicopter? Because we were already at high altitude there. To get up above that took a lot of high altitude. So we got up in a high altitude helicopter, and I'm looking at the fire burning up the valley, and I can see it's going to burn up the valley, and at the top of the valley is an old burn that burned some years previously. So there's not much fuel for that fire. When it gets to the top, it's going to burn itself out because there's not fuel to keep it going. The down stuff has been burned up and the old trees are gone. So there really wasn't much reason to do anything. I said, just get a ranger and drop him in on one of these mountain tops and give him binoculars and a radio and tell him to keep track of it. He said, well, you got one more problem. He says, down on the ground with their television crews is Dan Brokaw and, Tom Brokaw and Dan... Who? Ratter. I get to have mind lapses now. But so there's Rather out in Brokaw, ready to just pounce on us. The Park Service didn't learn its lesson in the last fires, and they're not doing anything. They're just sitting here looking at it, so forth and so on. I said, well, how much would it cost to fight it? He said about $2 million. And I said, gee, that's a lot of money to spend just to make the television back east look good at night. You got any other ideas? He said, well, I'll tell you what. He said, there's a road that goes into the fire, and there's a road that exits out to the back. And he said, what we can do is block the road into the fire from any civilians, crew, you know, the television crews. And he says, we can run firefighters in there, and we can drag hose, and they make it dusty, and we go in a circle and bring the same firefighters back in, like more are arriving all the time. And I said, well, how much would that cost? He said, about $200,000. And I said, well, let's do the $200,000 fight. And we did, and sure enough, that night on the evening news, Oak broke off, and rather, well, the Park Service learned its lessons from last year's fire, and they are aggressively fighting this fire from day one. Well, I think it just tells you a little bit about, you know, whether you can trust everything you see on the news or not. The other thing that I would mention that was highly emotional was the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone. Wolves had been hunted to extinction, and there really wasn't a predator in the food chain to keep the elk population in some sort of control. And the wolf was the last major, the grizzly was there, and the wolf was the last major predator that was left out of the cycle. Well, of course, the Wyoming and the cattlemen and all those people didn't want any wolves, you know, and so that became a very, very hot issue very, very quickly. The public generally across the United States, and one of the hardest things about running the National Park Service is the people that live right by the park always assume that that's their park. Well, Yellowstone belongs as much to the people of Georgia, New Jersey, New York, whatever, as it does to the person who lives in Cody, Wyoming. But it's hard to convince them of that, especially when they're making money running snowmobiles into the park. But, so, reintroducing the wolves into Yellowstone really became an issue. And I went over to visit a congressman from Montana who, to this day, remains one of my most unfavorite people. And he had a dead wolf pelt scratched out in front of his desk, and I walked in, and the first time I ever met the guy, he says, right now you see that wolf pelt? He says, that's the only way I ever want to see a wolf in Montana. And of course he had the backing of the Cattlemen's Association, who was a pretty potent group out in the West. But the pressure to reintroduce the wolves were intense, and we decided to go to reintroduce the wolves, despite the local people being against it. And the interesting thing is that the wolf has restored, in fact, the ecosystem. They are controlling the elk population. And this one little town up in the corner of the park, who everyone had been against putting in the wolves, but this was a little town that basically closed in the winter. I mean, their motels closed, the restaurants closed. It was a dead town in the winter because they were all snowed in. What happened to them? People from all over the country wanted to see those wolves interact with the population of elk, and there's a high ridge there where you can drive into the park and you can see the wolves chasing the elk, and the elk dropping off their young and hiding them here and there, and the wolves doing what they were meant to do in nature. And all of a sudden that town came to life in the winter, and the cash registers are ringing like mad, and the tourists are coming like mad, and the gas stations are selling. So all of a sudden those people, you know, there was a total change in attitude about the wolves. The other thing I would say about Yellowstone is we had a lady that moved a cult religious group, got hundreds of thousands of acres on the north edge of the park. She moved from Los Angeles, and she ran a church called the Church Universal and Triumphant. The short name for it was cut, and her name was Ma Prophet, and I called her More Prophet. And she would cast And the Montana, being a sparsely populated state, at first they were very happy these people came, and she had quite a following. I'm talking about thousands of people, lawyers, doctors, everything that she had in this group, and boy, Mont Prophet was #1 citizen, until they started digging around in the camp and found hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of illegal weapons buried, and all of these kinds of things. So the Church Universal and Triumphant has now, if you go to Montana, they're looked at as potentially people like that were down at Waco, for example. And that's exactly what she wanted to drill into the geothermal resources on the north edge of the park to get hot water for her church group. And I refused, because I said, what if she drills into that and it somehow opens up a leak directly into the Yellowstone, and Old Faithful isn't faithful anymore. And I'm the guy that's the head of the National Park Service, and I gave her a permit, and it dried up Old Faithful. I said, you know, I'm not going to do it. She didn't have enough science to convince me that they could drill and not relieve the pressure that makes Old Faithful faithful. So that was another major issue, is drilling for geothermal resources in Old Faithful. Ellis Island, we opened Ellis Island while I was the director, and the Statue of Liberty was closed, and then we reopened that. That was a very easy project to raise money for. In fact, I had to make the fundraisers stop raising money because they were getting paid a percentage. And it was so easy to raise money for Ellis Island. All you had to do was send a letter out, find out someone said, we found that your ancestor came through Ellis Island in whatever year, and wouldn't you like to contribute $100 and we'll put a star on a plaque? I mean, the money just rolled in. Lee Iacocca was chairman of the commission, and finally Lee Iacocca and I got together and said, you know, we need to stop. This money is coming in too easily, and these guys are making too much money. But Ellis Island, when it opened, became the biggest tourist attraction on the East Coast the day it opened its doors. And we had a problem because people would come. We thought they would come and stay for a while, and then they would leave. An hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. They didn't. They came in the morning, stayed all day, and wanted to get the last boat back to New York. So we had these huge lines, and a lot of people that were unhappy. And I said, who in the country knows how to handle lines better than we do? Well, it's got to be Walt Disney. Disney knows how to handle lines better than almost anyone. And so we traded employees with the Disney World. Said, you give us 25 of your employees, we'll give us 25 of our employees. You teach us how to handle lines better than we know how now. And of course, now everyone does it. I mean, you don't have a straight line, you have the snake lines, and you have, which makes it you think it's not longer. And you also have music or entertainment or something so that people don't realize that they're standing there for an hour before they get to the main attraction. The last thing I want, well, a couple more things, and I don't know what time it is. Okay, so I'm doing okay. We had a very interesting set of personal experiences with the Rockefeller family. The only two remaining brothers alive were, and David is the only one that's still alive, and Lawrence Rockefeller. Their grandfather, of course, had amassed huge fortunes, and their father had spent a lot of time buying back land and ending up putting it into the National Park Service. Much of the Grand Tetons, for example, was a donation of the Rockefellers. Much of the island that's down in St. John's. St. John's was a Rockefeller donation. And these people were just so kind and so gentle. And my wife and I had been up to visit our son, who was going to Dartmouth, which is up in New Hampshire, just on the Vermont line. And we were walking along the Ottaquechee River. we saw this beautiful old farmhouse restored, and I said, boy, I wonder who lives there. And never thought a thing about it after that, just wondered who lived there. Well, Lawrence Rockefeller called me and he said, we have a home that's been in our family, my wife's family, for a number of generations up in Vermont, and we would like for you to come and be our house guests. So they sent a corporate jet. The living room in it was as big as this room, and picked us up, and we went up, and we spent a lot of time with the Rockefellers talking over what they might like to do with a lot of property they had, not only there, but in Hawaii and other places that they had a lot of property. And one of the things that I was so impressed with, I'm a fairly early riser, and I woke up and I went downstairs and I didn't see anyone around, and it was about 5:30 in the morning. And then Mrs. Rockefeller, who was a very regal looking lady, probably in her mid-80s at that time, came in the door. She'd been out walking her dog. And she said, you know, I've read the Bible every morning in that window, little window well, all the years that I've lived in this house, and would you like to join me? And I thought, wow, this is, you know, and so we went in and we sat down, and she read for a while, and then she said, my eyes are getting tired, would you read for a while? I mean, she was just such a gentle lady. And so we had a hearing up there, and a lot of people had, the Rockefellers go beneath the surface. They're not, well, they're not out in the public a lot. So we had this hearing, and there was some opposition to their giving the land. I think the local people thought it would go off the tax base. And who's going to cover the tax base? Well, so we had the meeting. It was Mr. Rockefeller, Mrs. Rockefeller, the Senator Jeffers from that state, and myself, in a crowded church in that town of Vermont. And Mr. Rockefeller said to me, she said, Mrs. Rockefeller would like to give a prayer before we have this hearing. And you could feel that there was animosity in the audience, and times were going to get tough probably. And I thought, well, you know, we got separation church, state, what the heck? Yes, that's fine, and she should do that. And she got up, and she said, her prayer was, I'll paraphrase, her prayer was, Dear Lord, to those who you've given so much, help us to figure out the ways to give it back. And that whole church just was silent as a pin, and from there on, it was just a love in terms of trying to figure out how for them to give this massive farm back. When someone brought up the tax problem, Mr. Rockefeller said, how much is it? How much are the taxes on that per year? And I don't recall what it was, but he said, I'll tell you what, he said, I'll give $9 million, we'll put it in the bank here, it'll throw off the interest and it'll pay the taxes forever. So let's don't worry about it. And I thought that was kind of nice of it. Do it that way. I mean, we were there, I was having breakfast with him one morning, and he would go in the kitchen and have oatmeal, and, you know, the cook would be cooking, and he had his advisors, and one of the guys was reading the Wall Street Journal, and Lawrence was spooning in the oatmeal, and the advisor said, Lawrence, he's like he's discovered something, does you want to know how to make a small fortune? Lawrence looked over at him, and the guy said, well, first you start with a big one. So we had a lot of fun with the Rockefellers. I'll tell one story about the other side. David's wife is a pretty feisty gal, and she has beautiful land along the Hudson River where she raises prize cattle. And some lady of some considerable wealth bought land across the road from her and put up a big home, and maybe she had 10 or 15 acres. But she started complaining to the local officials about the smell of Mrs. Rockefeller's cattle. It's bothering her. Well, of course, Mrs. Rockefeller had been raising cattle there. I mean, the Rockefellers were for I don't know how many generations along the banks at the top of their toward West Point. And Mrs. Rockefeller went to her and she said, now I know that you bought this land and built this house because of the beautiful view you have of my property over here. And if you don't quit complaining about the smell of my cattle, I'm going to divide it into quarter-acre lots and put up
14,000 square or 4,000 square foot homes all across this place. Ruin your view. So the lady stopped complaining. That's some of the same problems we have today, right? I mean, where are we going to put the confinement hog facilities? Where are we going to put the dairies and so forth and so on? We've got the same kind of problems today. Maybe I'll end with a few words about boondoggles. One of the problems was, and I had the first $1 billion budget while I was Parks Director that the Park Service had ever had. And people would, my budget would get cut at the Secretary's level, get cut from the President's budget, and would end up in Congress maybe, let's say it's $800 million.
Well, then I would go to Congress to testify on the budget, and you have the Democrats and the Republicans, and who's ever in the chair is in the most powerful position. And these people want to add things into our budget and maybe take things out. So they would give us the $1 billion, but it wouldn't be the same things we asked for in the budget. It's some local park in West Virginia. It's some other, we gave $60 million to a congressman in Pennsylvania who was on both the Republican and the Democrat ticket and was under indictment for some sort of a crime. But that's how powerful he was. He got $60 million put into my budget for a place called Steamtown. So if you ever go in Pennsylvania to look at, and you go to see Steamtown National Historic Park, it's about steam engines, railroads, so forth and so on. But the truth of it is, it's a fancied up shopping mall for Scranton, Pennsylvania. But that's how $60 million would get into my budget, and then I wouldn't have $60 million that I was going to use at Yellowstone or someplace like that. And one of the most embarrassing things for me, in my first board meeting, I was on the board of the Kennedy Center, and I went over, and I'll describe it. They have a room in there that has one of these roofs, ceilings, that you can hear everything like a whisper. Someone whispers in the back, you can hear it way over here. And woe be to those who didn't realize that, because some things were said that shouldn't be said. But I noticed it first because I was in there and I heard Ted Kennedy talking, and he was on the other side of the room. And I thought, my gosh, what a voice. This guy has got an unbelievable voice. It's like he's in my ear. And then he's curled over there. Well, then I learned about this ceiling thing. I was on the board of it, and I should have been supporting the Kennedy Center, which I was, but they wanted a much bigger budget. I knew that every dollar more they got was a dollar I was going to lose for Yellowstone or Yosemite or whatever, which were in bad shape. And so I argued against the budget increase for the Kennedy Center. Well, after I, gave my impassioned plea, I didn't realize till she told me, or she spoke out, she said, "Are you against the budget increase for my poor slain brother's memorial?" It was President Kennedy's sister. Did I feel bad? I felt right, but I felt bad about that. And this is a little bit ribald, but I think you can handle it here in Wabash. In one of our board meetings, and I'm talking about people around the board here are the kind of people that if you get asked to serve by the president, you're expected to give or get, which means you give it yourself or you go get it, like $250,000 to serve on that board as a gift to the Kennedy Center. And it's kind of how it works. So the people sitting around the table were people that had big pocketbooks. And but there was one old girl, and they were at the end of the table were these gals that I would have called elderly New York City debutantes. And they had lots of money. And there was one old lawyer who was the board's lawyer, and we had a rather heavy lunch. And to make a long story short, he fell asleep in the afternoon session. And he started passing gas. And in that room, it was like bullets. Boom, boom, boom. And I watched these gals trying to pretend that this wasn't happening. They were sitting just as straight as a second grader.
I wanted to throw a pencil to this poor old guy. I didn't feel like I could get up, walk over and shake him. So if you're ever in the Kennedy Center and you're in that room, be careful what you say. Everyone can hear you. The last major accomplishment, probably the biggest accomplishment, and it's a financial accomplishment that I had, was that the concessionaires, the people that run the big hotels and all that sort of thing in the national parks, are not national parks people. Those people bid for contracts to run those things. And they had, it was embarrassing how little they were paying. But it went clear back to the days when those big hotels were built by the railroad companies and to move people to the west. They were paying, like, in some cases, like in the Yosemite, 1/2% of gross, their gross number. Well, their gross income. Well, here's a little hint. It's better to take a percentage of gross than the net profit, because they can make the net profit kind of whatever they want to make it with expenses. But I knew that if they were going to cheat me, they had to cheat me based on the gross, which you had to report to the IRS. So if they were going to cheat me, they were going to cheat the IRS, and then I knew I had a big legal stick. So we changed Yellowstone, for an example, from, if you can believe this, 1/2% of gross to 18% of gross. And boy, you sure heard me yelling and screaming all the way to the Oval Office. But the president, all the time I was there, the president backed me 100%. And we got that reform done, and it poured millions of dollars into the parks that wouldn't have otherwise been there. So that was probably changing the way to do business with all the concessionaires that are in the parks, whether they're running hotels, boats, whatever they're doing, was huge. Actually, I can't stop. I got to do one more. We were having the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and I was the master of ceremonies. The president was the speaker. One of our speakers was Lumpy. Wrote all the books we've all read. Alaska, Michener, and it was hot. It was really hot, and I thought Michener would be there just for an hour, give his speech, and leave. Well, he and his wife came, and they stayed, and so we had an air-conditioned trailer behind the stage. I said, "We'd like to invite you to be in a more comfortable situation." So to sit for 2 days and talk to James Michener was really something. But in his speech, he says, you know, and he was a World War II veteran. He said, from Pennsylvania, kind of from the Dutch country down there, and he said, and he married an Oriental lady. He said, I didn't know what they would say when I went back to Pennsylvania Dutch country with an Oriental wife. And he says, you know, they didn't mind at all that she was Oriental, but they were very unhappy she was a Democrat. And the other thing that came out of that was there's a group called the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association. And to be a member of that group, you had to be at Pearl Harbor on the day in uniform. You couldn't have been out at Schofield Barracks or on leave or something. You had to be there on that day in uniform. Well, can you imagine the emotion that poured out when a Japanese pilot who had bombed Pearl Harbor applied for membership? And they said, you got to be kidding. He said, I was there on the day in uniform. And later, after the war, he had come to the United States and I think become a Methodist minister up in Oregon or somewhere like that. But he wanted, he didn't get it. He didn't get it. Well, maybe I should stop there and maybe take a few questions if there's time, and just kind of turn it loose to anyone that might. Yes, sir.
How does a piece of property become a part of the National Park Service? So sort of go through that procedure.
Well, let's say that the National Park Service wanted the property in the first place, which is, okay, that's always going to be a question. But essentially what would happen would be that that piece of property would have to be evaluated, put in the Park Service budget request, and acted on by Congress as to whether it would become part of the National Park Service or not. And so it actually,
it comes down to an act of Congress well, in every instance. Now, there's some people, yeah.
Can anybody live on a national park site?
It depends on how the legislation is written when they write in the national park, make it a national park. And I'll give you a good example where it's caused a lot of hard feelings. But the Indiana Lakeshore, the dunes up here in the north, well, when they created that park, they paid the people that had the home, they evaluated them, they paid them in cash and gave them so many years to leave, like 20 years. Well, what happened was the land became more valuable. The people lived there for 20 years. Then they were sorry that they sold it 20 years ago and they want to stay. And that's still the situation. It's almost a battle over every home, and people feel sorry for the people that are leaving their home, but they sold it, 20 years ago and put that money in the bank. And so there are some situations where and this is more true in Britain, by the way, there are situations in the national parks where they have allowed villages and things like that to stay and remain, but more in their historical kind of setting. Yes,
What
ma'am.
about this bridge that they built in Yellowstone? Is that going to be an asset or deface it?
Now, I may not be familiar with the bridge in Yellowstone.
Well, they were going to extend the viewpoint there in Yellowstone.
Oh, you mean the one it's Grand Canyon.
Grand
Okay.
Canyon, Grand Canyon.
I think it'll probably be an asset for tourists. It's not on National Park Service land, it's on Indian land. So the Indians can do what they want. That probably wouldn't have been approved had it been on National Park Service land, but it belongs to the Navajos, and so it'll be a tourist attraction for them, and probably successful.
Will they get the money for it?
Yes.
Okay, well,
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of close relationships developed and a lot of arguments developed between the Park Service and the Indians and geological remains, and I would hate to say, but I would bet, and the Park Service would wish they didn't have these things, but I would say the Park Service probably has thousands of skeletal remains stored here and there. Sometimes the tribes want them back, sometimes they don't. If you go out to Mesa Verde National Park, for example, there are all kinds of Indian remains that are, when they're found, they're stored, and what are you going to do with them? And who's got the right to say what to do with them? Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a lot of people applying to be part, like rangers?
Rangers?
Do you have a big backup of people, or do you have?
Yes. Usually what happens, if I'm advising a young person who wants to go into the field, I said, work on a part-time basis, on a seasonal basis, get your foot in the door. There are certain parks where you can get in more easily than others. Once you get in, the movement upward is fairly easy, but getting in is tough. So I would advise, go to a park where it's, and the best one that people go to is Philadelphia for the Liberty Bell. No one wants to go there because it's expensive to live. You don't get paid much. There are a lot of reasons they don't want to go to Philadelphia to be at the Liberty Bell, except that's probably the best chance you have to get in. And as soon as you get your time in there, maybe you can transfer to Yellowstone or Indiana Dunes or wherever you want to go. But it's fairly difficult to get in. National Park Service hires more landscape architects than any organization in the world. You wouldn't really think that, but they have a huge construction budget that goes all over the United States, and landscape architects are major people involved in that construction budget. Well, thank you for coming. Hope you had a good lunch, and I got here just about on time. I wanted to say that I have written this book. We have it for sale in the museum. I don't get anything out of it. Whatever if you buy one, the money goes into the museum for gifts. If you want to buy one for a gift or whatever, I'd be glad to sign them if people want them signed. But in any event, I put them down here to make money for the museum.
And can I just say a couple other things here? If anybody here is a veteran or knows of any veterans who have not participated in the Veterans History Project, that Senator Lugar is sponsoring. It's through the National Archives. We have two interns from Manchester College here who are focusing on that this summer. So if you haven't, or if you know of anybody that was a veteran of any war or participated in the war effort in any way, please have them call the museum and we'll get them scheduled, because we really want to make a big impact as much as we can this summer. And also, I wanted to tell you that if you paid, if you're not already a member and you paid your admission fee today, if you become a member today, we'll give you credit for that. So just if anybody would like to become a member today.
And
Thank you.
by the way, this is a great museum.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. And it has everybody sign the sign-in sheet too, if you haven't, I've got one back here. Thank you.